Hey everyone, it's the Koopa Man. We discussed heroes and villains recently, and in that video I mentioned anti-heroes and anti-villains as an exception that proves the rule of my thesis, that heroes represent good values and villains represent evil values. And even the existence of antis doesn't change that. But I also promised to talk more about anti-heroes and anti-villains in their own video, so let's talk about them. Now, for those of you living under a rock, you may be wondering, what is an anti-hero or an anti-villain, or doesn't being an anti-hero make you a villain and vice versa? Well, you'd be sort of correct. The prefix anti does mean opposite, but how it's applied in both cases means the anti is in the expectation rather than being opposed to a hero or a villain. Anti-heroes have been defined since the early 1700s, when the term was first coined, as heroes who defy what's expected of a normal heroic figure. And sometime later, the term anti-villain became a natural extension of that. It isn't that these figures are just heroes as villains and villains as heroes, but they are heroes and villains in spite of basically being the opposite of what you expect from heroes and villains. For example, Venom. Take one good look at him and he looks like a bad guy, a monster even. The big teeth and alien tongue are a dead giveaway. But after a certain point in the comics, Venom is actually a hero fighting crime rather than what you expect him to do, which would probably be something along the line of eating old ladies. And even when he was a villain, he was less of a monster and more focused on just one guy, despite the fact that he beat up Black Cat within an inch of her life for the fun of it. Anti-heroes, as a definition, cast a pretty wide net, and there's many ways you can write an anti-hero, whereas anti-villains are a bit more narrow. As such, and to get it out of the way, we'll talk about the anti-villains first. Now, anti-villain is sort of a new term, but as you expect, they're villains who aren't mustache-twirling, laughing over dead baby types. They're usually more honorable, affable, or they have, or claim to have, more noble goals. Magneto from the X-Men is a good example of this. He's usually a nice enough person, provided you share his values, and even then, if you're not an outward racist, he'll gladly debate you on the subject. He's a Holocaust survivor, which defines a lot of his motivation to never see that sort of brutality enacted ever again on what he defines as his people, which in this case ends up being mutants rather than Jews, as once Charles Xavier opened his eyes to his power, he began to identify around that. And outside of Brian Michael Bendis' Ultimate Universe, he's not going to just slaughter people by the billions. By and large, he just wants mutant kind to be left in peace. The problems come in when you get into the fact that he thinks mutants are better than other humans, homo superior as he phrases it, and it's the ultimate motivating factor in a lot of his actions. He's doing it for racial superiority, not as an act of self-defense. And not to use a Bendis pen story as example, but in House of M, his ideal world is one with a racial caste system with mutants on top. Because of this, Magneto is still a villain in the end, because character is who you are in the dark. In his darkest, loneliest moments, Magneto would make the choice that benefits himself and his racial superiority ideology above making the selfless choice of human-mutant equality, because that would mean he doesn't get to be king. There's also Magnus the Red and his Thousand Sons Legion. He worked so hard to warn his father, the God Emperor of mankind, of Horus's betrayal. And how is he rewarded? The Space Wolves were sent to wipe his legion out for being sorcerers. Even in becoming a Daemon Prince of Tzeentch, he was doing it to save his sons. But he is a Daemon Prince of Tzeentch, one of the gods of chaos, and his legion are now traitor chaos worshippers, regardless of it sort of being against their will. Anti-villains are pretty much all like this. They'd be heroes were it not for one selfish flaw or another. Anti-heroes, on the other hand, can be more, to use a phrase run by the dumb progressives, diverse. In fact, TV Tropes has a whole sliding scale of anti-heroes we can dissect. First is the classical anti-hero. These are the oldest variety of anti-hero, as they're heroes who very much don't embody the virtues and traits that are expected of a hero. If Superman is the idealized hero, a powerful and kind beacon of hope who stands for truth, justice, and the American way, these characters are anything but. They're usually selfish, cowardly, sometimes lazy, and ultimately feel that they're going in way over their heads. Regardless, They are still heroes because they still will do the right thing when it comes down to it. For example, you have Huckleberry Finn. Whereas most tales of the time were about older men having adventures, Huck was just an illiterate dumb kid trying to help his friend get a better life, and I'll leave it at that as I'd very much like to keep my channel. Then in comics you have Spider-Man, who people forget is written to be a relatable everyman. Even more than that, an avatar for comic readers at the time. He's rather nerdy, was never all that athletic, struggles with money and love until he meets Mary Jane Watson, and even as Spider-Man, he has a fair share of selfish moments, which is what leads him to losing people close to him like Uncle Ben, Captain Stacy, Gwen Stacy, and even his former best friend Harry Osborn, who became evil to spite him and ultimately died for it. And all of that does weigh him down. But aside from a brief arc in the 60s and a little bit in the Clone Saga, it's never stopped him outright. Also from the comics is Supergirl. Unlike her cousin Clark, Kara Zor-El remembers her life and her family on Krypton. She has more of an attachment to them and has a harder time adjusting to the reality of Krypton being gone and her having to live on Earth. In addition, she's also a teenage girl, with all that comes with that. So of course every time she's introduced, she has a bit of a rough time adjusting. Even in the most recent iteration, the stress was enough for her to attract the Red Lantern ring and join the Red Lantern Corps for a bit. But there's no better example for a classical antihero than the titular Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins.
In the middle of the earth, in the land of Shire, lives a brave little hobbit whom we all admire. With his long wooden pipe, fuzzy woolly toes, he lives in a hobbit hole and everybody knows him. Bilbo, Bilbo Baggins, he's only 3 feet tall. Bilbo, Bilbo Baggins, the bravest little hobbit of them all.
He's short, middle-aged, and quite frankly, he really didn't even want to go on his adventure, being content living in his beautiful hole in the Shire. But he ultimately couldn't resist the call to adventure, and because of that, he stumbled his way into being the one man, hobbit or otherwise, to change the course of history in the Middle-earth forever. Mostly through a retcon, but still. The next tier is called a few things. Knight in Sour Armor, Disney Anti-Hero. I personally call them Tarnished Knights, but in the end it doesn't matter what you call them, it's all the same thing. They're more cynical heroes who continue to do what's right in spite of their cynicism. Or, to quote Beta Ray Bill,
I am alone. I look at the heavens and think them empty, and if not empty, I find the idea of worshipping whatever dwells there obscene. But why do you continue? It doesn't change what is right. If there is nothing but what we make in this world, brothers, let us make good.
Typically, a Tarnished Knight is very much unlike Spider-Man. They're wary on the outside and inside. They've been through it all so long that they just can't take it anymore, and yet they do it anyway.
I'm too old for this shit.
Examples include Amuro-Ray post the 1 Year War, who could have just been content retiring, but can't keep himself from doing the right thing, aiding the Aeug and eventually joining the mercenary company Londo Bell in the fight against the Federation and Zeon respectively. Then there's Humphrey Bogart's character in Casablanca, giving up his chance with the love of his life so she can aid her new lover in fighting the Nazis. Of course, in comic books, you got the X-Men. Cyclops and Charles Xavier especially have shades of this, having to deal with the whole world that hates and fears them bullshit for so long that they begin to question if it's even worth still going on. Though individual members of the team may vary, by and large the team itself remains in this category when you average it out. Green Arrow's Oliver Queen can be quite the cynical smartass too, but he never lets it stop him. And then there's Daredevil. All I can say is, poor Matt. After the tarnished hero is the pragmatic hero. Heroes who aren't afraid to do what has to be done. Basically, heroes who aren't afraid of doing something most would consider bad or unlawful if it serves the side of good and justice in the end. Granted, they're not zealots, just realists. Sometimes the best solution when someone is shooting at you is to shoot back. Examples include Batman, who, as exemplified by The Dark Knight, was willing to work outside the law as an outright outlaw, as well as be made a scapegoat so that Gotham can do what needs to be done to keep the mob behind bars. Even in the comics, he started out as an outlaw, and his MO is to put the fear of God into every criminal he meets, usually with the side of putting them in the ICU. Wonder Woman is ultimately like this as well, but she tends to hold back unless she has no other choice, and unlike Batman, has no aversions to killing when no other option is present. She is, after all, an Amazon warrior woman, comes with the territory. Harry Potter and his friends have broken more than their fair share of rules in the name of stopping Voldemort and his followers. Jack Bauer has also thrown the rulebook out the window in the name of stopping the terrorists each season. And then, of course, you can't forget Dirty Harry Callahan.
Callahan?
Sir?
I don't want any more trouble like you had last year in the Fillmore district. Understand? That's my policy.
Yeah, well, when an adult male is chasing a female with intent to commit rape, I shoot the bastard. That's my policy.
Intent? How did you establish that?
When a naked man is chasing a woman through an alley with a butcher knife and a hard on, I figure he isn't out collecting for the Red Cross.
I think he's got a point.
Though Dirty Harry leans more into the next category, the unscrupulous hero. This is what most people think of when they think of anti-heroes. The 90s anti-heroes. The badass with the gun, or the bow, or the alien symbiote, or whatever. The point is they put criminals in the ground.
What's the plan?
Plan? We put him in the ground. You got there. I'm thinking you folks are time travelers.
Where would you get a crazy idea like that?
Experience? I've had an interesting life.
It's very old Western how it plays out, fitting enough, as Dirty Harry is a Western set in the modern day. These heroes don't have the same restraint that Batman and Wonder Woman have. They will kill the bad guy. End of discussion. The poster boy of this is Frank Castle, the Punisher. And the funny thing is, he, like Venom, actually started out as a villain. But his mindset was so compelling, they started to give him solo stories and making him slightly less extreme in his mindset. Can't have your title character machine gunning down jaywalkers and still be taken seriously after all. DC also has their fair share. There's Helena Bertinelli as the Huntress, Jason Todd as Red Hood, and of course, when Black Adam was more heroic, he leaned into this category. But above all others are my favorites, the anti-hero trinity. First is Artemis of Banner Midal, who took the role of Wonder Woman in the early 90s. She had far less scruples on putting the bad guy down than Diana did, and unfortunately, died fighting the evil white magician. But she later came back as a demon huntress, and is now a fairly consistent anti-heroine. There's a bit more to it than that, but again, I like having my YouTube channel, so we'll leave it at that. Then there was the reign of the Supermen. 4 successors to Superman after his seeming death at the hands of Doomsday. Aside from Steel, who was pretty much the classical anti-hero at worst, and was sort of wearing the shield as inspiration more than anything. There was also Superboy, a clone of Superman, and later revealed, also Lex Luthor. He was, in the first iteration, a spunky smartass and a bit of a punk, but in a way that made him kind of endearing. The actual nominal anti-hero of Reign of the Superman was Eradicator, a Kryptonian AI that based itself on Superman to uphold Kryptonian justice in his stead. The thing is though, Kryptonian justice is pretty harsh. This was the planet that produced General Zod. A few criminals even called him a fascist, even if Eradicator would probably also energy blast fascists with just as much vigor if he caught them breaking the law. Basically, he was Superman if Superman was Judge Dredd. And we really don't need to talk about Cyborg Superman, as while he was ultimately an unscrupulous hero at first, he was revealed to be a villain with a grudge against Superman. And finally, filling in for Batman was Jean-Paul Valley, who was Azrael, a Catholic Knight-themed vigilante, though Valley had issues, due to the anti-papist cult that he was indoctrinated by, and because the fact that comic writers who had him after his initial run were anti-theist dickheads. As such, he's never had the chance to shine as a pragmatic anti-hero Knight Templar-styled character. But still, when he filled in for Batman, he had to be stopped, and after that, he felt major remorse. Examples outside of comics of unscrupulous 90s anti-heroes include Charles Bronson's character in Death Wish, Conan the Barbarian, The Shadow, Harry Dresden from the Dresden Files, Father Alexander Anderson from Hellsing, and even Piccolo and Vegeta from Dragon Ball. And of course, finally is the nominal anti-hero. To make a long story short, I don't consider these to be heroes, anti or otherwise. They're villains who sometimes do good things, like my Dr. Doom example from the Heroes and Villains video. They're selfish, violent, egotistical, and the fact that their actions did lead to a good outcome is in pure spite of who they are. End of. Alucard from Hellsing is a good example of this, though he does develop a tiny bit, but he's still ultimately the vampire lord who gloats about it. He's a monster that the Hellsing organization keeps on a leash and forces to do good. And were it not for the fact that he had a code of personal honor, he'd kill us all and laugh about it. At the end of the day though, anti-heroes are still heroes, and anti-villains are still villains. Not much changes with that prefix. Their existence does not change what moral good and moral evil are. Those remain static. But it's also interesting to see characters, from time to time, who aren't what you expect from a morally pure hero or a morally reprehensible villain. Variety is, after all, the spice of life. And that's all I got for this one. This has been the Koopa Man. If you like this video, be sure to check out my channel for more. Don't forget to like and subscribe, as it helps my channel grow. And talk about it in the comments about your favorite anti-heroes and anti-villains. Yes, that means you, swordsman. Your comments about how great Venom is gets my channel engagement. And until next time, game on.